Series 2, Episode 17, and I'm with Nick Asbury, and we're going to talk about lots of things because you do a lot of things.
Yeah, I guess I do. I am finding the potted biography gets longer and longer to tell these days. It may be an age thing. I turned 50 recently, so um, yeah, it's getting slightly more complicated. But I very broadly call myself a writer, a creative writer, which maybe doesn't explain that much. But shall I try and outline what I do for you or for the listeners?
Yeah, yes, please.
Yeah, so I try and keep a very I guess, varied writing life. So my main kind of income is from doing freelance writing for branding and marketing kind of projects. I guess that's the world I'm kind of best known in as a writer and as a commentator. I kind of write around that whole subject as well. But I've always tried to mix it with other things, poetry being one of them. So I've done a few poetry projects in my time. I guess the best known one is Real Time Notes, which was we'll perhaps get onto that later, but it was a kind of three and a half year project of writing fast poems at the rate of at least one every day. But I also, I've done kind of humorous writing. I did one kind of downbeat journal called The Perpetual Disappointments Diary, which started off as a jokey idea, which I published independently, but it's one of my few ideas that turned into a commercial hit. So that's had a proper publisher and that was like a nice story to be part of. And then, yeah, lots of other just experimental projects. I kind of dabble in Tin Pan Alley era songwriting, which is a relatively recent thing I've started exploring. And yeah, kind of other experimental stuff. I did a written version of a podcast called Text Radio, which was an experiment in writing at speed and actually interviewing people inside a live Google Doc, so that we would type backwards and forward to each other, and people were able to follow along in real time. So it was kind of an in-between medium between writing and speech. So I'm interested in all, trying to keep a lot of things on the go at once, and hopefully they all feed into each other and keep things interesting.
Well, I was going to ask you about that. To what extent they feed into each other, and to what extent you see yourself as a brand. You're doing all these things, and do they support each other in some way?
Yeah, interesting question. I think, I guess as a metaphor, I tend to think of it as a kind of ecosystem, writing ecosystem, where you want to try and keep things diverse. And if you concentrate too much on one thing, then it's not healthy for the the overall sustainability of the ecosystem. In terms of thinking of myself as a brand, I guess I really try not to. Not least because most people have never heard of me in the sense that's normally something you expect with branding. But I guess also, given that I've got one foot in that world and I write stuff for brands, I'm quite often involved in the stage where maybe a design company is visually rebranding a company, and I get involved in the verbal side, trying to help them work out who they are and how to express it in words. So I see that process from the inside, and it makes me very aware that brands are a fiction, if you know what I mean. They're kind of this weird anthropomorphic face that you paint on a company, and it doesn't necessarily bear a great relation to the reality. I don't necessarily mean that in a sinister way. Like, I think branding can be a perfectly almost natural and normal thing to do in a market-based world, but I resist the idea of individual human beings trying to turn themselves into brands. I guess I kind of think if you've already got a fixed idea of who you are and what your brand is, maybe that's going to close doors in advance that might be worth opening.
That's a good point. That's interesting. I mean, I think there are different ways to look at branding, because I would say that I wouldn't disagree necessarily. But I tend to think, okay, well, what else can I bring into my brand? People probably don't want me to be a one-dimensional character who just writes palindromes. So maybe I'll bring in some music and I'll do all these other things. But of course, you're right that these are things I want to do anyway. So it's not as though I'm I'm trying to create a persona. It's all just me still.
Yeah, it is a good thing as a writer, I think, to have a sense of how you are landing with other people. Who do other people out there think that I am or think that you are? It's kind of good, I think, to have some sense of that in your mind. And I guess you could call that a brand,
Mm.
because I do think, part of the goal of writing, just in a very basic way, is communication. It's all we've got to kind of somehow connect with each other. So I think if as a writer you're not thinking about how you come across to other people, how you're perceived, and therefore how something you write is going to land, then maybe you're missing something. But maybe that could be a kind of personality trait as well. I guess some people are very much themselves, and the world can take them or leave them as they are. Whereas I think my instincts are a little bit more, I guess you would use the word empathetic, or I think that's a skill you try and use in advertising and marketing, is to try and see things from the perspective of the people you're writing for. So I guess even when I'm writing a poem, I will be, maybe more than other poets, I might be consciously thinking about how's this gonna be as a reading experience, not just as a writing experience.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, it's easy to say, well, I just write what I write, and I don't, if the audience likes it, fine. But I think it's impossible to put the idea out of your head completely that someone's going to read it, and you do want to know that they're comfortable reading it and that they'll get something from it.
Yeah. Is that important to you? Like, are you conscious of building a readership? I mean, you must be in the commercial sense that you're trying to make a living out of this stuff. But is it important to you to be read, or do you just get the satisfaction of? I think particularly with your kind of poetry, which is it's extremely, each one is a real like technical accomplishment in a very self-contained way almost. That I can imagine the satisfaction of just getting one of those poems done must be almost 95% of it, and then it's, if 100 people read it or 10,000 people read it, maybe it doesn't matter too much.
Yeah, I'd say that's right. And of course, when I'm working on one of the big projects, I'm not thinking about the audience so much because I'm so focused on just getting the job done. And with those bigger ones as well, it's kind of pointless to think about the audience because they tend to either land or not. People either connect with it or they don't. And I could spend days working on something and then post it on Twitter and it gets 10 likes. Whereas I could just rattle off something simple in 15 minutes, put that on Twitter and it gets 200 likes. So, I mean, for example, I know that if I post a satirical palindrome about Boris Johnson, it's going to do well.
Yeah.
Whereas if I post two palindromic sonnets that are perfect anagrams of each other, maybe people will be impressed, maybe they'll be indifferent. But I do think about the audience in one way, which is that because I post various things on Twitter, and I do take note of what is liked and what appeals to people, and I perhaps think, oh, maybe I should do more of those. Because I don't want to become so self-indulgent. I'm just doing these obscure avant-garde experiments.
I think it is a great, it's a kind of novel feature of our times, really, only in the last decade or so. The writers have had this issue. If you can get instant feedback on what you're writing. And I had this constantly when I was doing this real-time notes project, where I would write these kind of fast poems using the notes app on my phone and take a screenshot and just post it up to Instagram and sometimes Twitter as well. So you would get immediate feedback. You would see the hearts either mounting up or it just, the tumbleweed going by. And it's hard to resist the pull of the algorithm. You do, I think, inevitably. I mean, just like you, I know if I wrote a kind of tirade against, say, Boris Johnson, that's going to go down well. And, there's this phenomenon of audience capture, they call it, where you just subconsciously, I think, you get drawn into being the performing monkey for your audience. in a way. You get molded by them into a certain person. So I was always conscious of trying to resist it in some way. Like, you want the likes and you want your project to be kind of shared and successful. But I was always conscious of putting in awkward stuff as well. Like, you would do quite a few of them were kind of jokey poems, quite kind of loose, comedic kind of things. But then I would quite like following that up with something really quite kind of weird, surreal, stream of consciousness, a bit philosophical maybe, and just try and keep that mix going so that you were never quite sure what mode or style the next poem would be in, really.
Yeah, I think I can think, well, I'm making it too easy for people now. All these poems have been simple. I'm making it far too easy for the reader. Now I've got to throw something difficult in.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. But this is branding of a kind.
Mm.
So I meant by personal branding that it's branding, but it's genuine. It's still me.
Mm.
But I'm trying to introduce some variety to sort of show a fuller personality. But
Yes.
it's not invented. So I am interested though in the work you do where you are effectively inventing a personality for a company. I'd like to know how you got into it to start with.
Yeah, I many people in my world have a standard answer to that question, which is that they stumbled into it, which is always a slightly unsatisfying answer because you kind of think, well, there must have been some conscious method behind it. But
that's true of lots of things, though.
I guess,
if you're a writer.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I did an English degree. Writing was always my main thing, although it took me a while to realize it. I left university with no clue what I wanted to do in life. I actually went into a bit of a slump in the following couple of years where I couldn't seem to find the motivation to kind of find any particular career appealing. You kind of think, well, what can you do with a writing, a literature degree, maybe academia or teaching or journalism, or I think advertising did cross my mind, but I perceived advertising as being a very kind of 1980s brash, competitive world that I really didn't want to be part of. But I did a telesales job, which was I was extremely unsuited for. But as a little side project within that, I had to write an ad at one point for the magazine I was working for. And it was a very small thing, but it turned into a published ad. And it was the first time where I thought, actually, and it really did feel like a revelation. I thought, oh yeah, of course I can write. I realized I was better at writing than everyone else in the office, and that's why I'd ended up writing this ad. And it had never really occurred to me that the main skill I'd learned by doing a literature degree wasn't really anything to do with literature or critical theory or all that kind of stuff. It was really just an ability to write. So I realized that was the professional skill I had. I ended up getting into a copywriting role at a minor kind of design agency. And I ended up in this world that's kind of adjacent to advertising, but not quite the same as it. So I work mainly with branding and design companies who are a slightly different kind of thing to the big ad agencies. They tend to be smaller companies. It's slightly more. It's a slightly more human, less egotistical industry, I would say, than the kind of classic Adland world. So that suited me better. And just ever since then, really, I've gradually branched out to do more and more things in that world. So, and actually, it lends itself to a freelance lifestyle, which is what I have now. So I sit in my loft up near Macclesfield and just can do all the work over email and Zoom calls and that kind of thing. So and it actually also lends itself to me doing other stuff around it, which is part of what I enjoy.
And how does the process work? What sorts of guidelines are you given, or do you have a lot of creative control over the branding and advertising?
Yeah, it varies a lot. I think I'm trying to think of like a typical example, I guess. I worked recently, a couple of years ago, with a design company who were rebranding Mozilla, the internet company Mozilla. it works differently on each project, but they would already have a kind of strategy in mind. They would do lots of workshops with the client. They would ask them lots of questions about who they are, what their frustrations are with their current image, and what messages they really want to get out there. And I wouldn't be involved in all that kind of workshop stuff, but I would take the output from that and try and turn it into something creatively written and somehow inspiring and written in their voice. And the output might just be 2 paragraphs that just sum up who Mozilla is, who they want to be, why they exist, and written in a voice that feels distinctively like them as opposed to like Google or like Apple. So that's the essence of the job, I guess. And then the bit of it I enjoy most is, in order to bring that, having got those kind of 2 paragraphs that sum up the brand, you would then try and bring it to life in headlines and kind of ideas for ads and various creative executions, I guess, that had an idea in them, had maybe some kind of humor or some kind of wit or lateral thinking or play on words. And it's that dimension of the job that I enjoy most. I like any projects that involve lateral thinking. And yeah, I think wit is probably the best word rather than humor, because they're not always funny, the kind of end results, but they involve some kind of, I guess, lateral connections between ideas and trying to come up with headlines that maybe make you think slightly and just create a little penny dropping moment in your mind, I guess.
Yeah, well, I've seen plenty of examples over the last couple of days on your website, and
Right, yeah,
and then some of them, the UNICEF one, the FGM. But so that's the essence of it is we're talking about acronyms, and so it almost starts off like it's playful and fun. And
yes,
it's about something very serious. I mean, so that's a brilliant one, because that gets people thinking, it gets their attention.
Yes. Yeah, and that is so often the goal with any piece of advertising, because that thing you saw, I mean, it was just setting the acronym FGM alongside common social media acronyms like LMAO or ROFL. It was kind of, the point of it being that FGM is not an acronym that any child should really be familiar with. And yeah, I think when you see that, as you're, maybe if that was an ad on social media as you're scrolling through Instagram, or if it's something you see on the tube on the way to work or something, it's just got enough in it to give you pause and maybe have that little moment of, oh yeah, I get it. And it's often hard to strike the balance just right, that you're not making it so obscure and so kind of clever that it's just passing people by. It needs to be pitched in a certain way where people get that satisfaction of the penny dropping moment in a way, but it's not too excluding, or it needs to be something most people will get, or at least most of the people who are relevant to that particular audience.
So it's a tricky balancing act. I mean, what I thought was brilliant about that one is that if you just overstepped a bit too much, it could look like you're making light of it.
Sure.
Instead, it's just got the right level of, I wouldn't say humor, because there's nothing funny about that issue, but it's got something that would press the same buttons as a jokey advert.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. I co-edited a book actually it's called A Smile in the Mind, and the subtitle is Witty Thinking in Graphic Design. And it's a compendium of work like that UNICEF example. It's work that involves wit or lateral thinking or kind of penny dropping moments. But actually a lot of the work is serious. It's not, there is funny stuff in there, but a lot of it is just stuff that maybe involves some kind of shift in perception, some unexpected twist. And I think, a lot of the best advertising does work that way. I could, if life had worked out differently and you'd stumbled into this line of work, I can imagine you would be exactly suited to it, because so much of it is about playing with words within actually quite tight constraints, which is certainly something you do.
Well, do you have any examples of when you've used literary constraints in this line of work? I know you have in your poetry, but
yeah. I mean, I guess stepping away from me personally, I can think of plenty of examples in that that are famous within advertising generally. One of my favorite ads, probably of all time, actually, although it's not particularly well known, but it was an ad that came out in 2004, I think. It was advertising the last ever episode of Friends was about to air on Channel 4. It was coming up on Friday nights. And it was a big TV moment. It was at the end of that era where everyone used to watch the same program at the same time. Although I suppose Succession has slightly revived that. But yeah, it was a big cultural moment. And the brief was to create a press ad that would just build up anticipation, remind people that it was airing on Friday night. And the answer was just so beautifully simple because they just took, if you can picture the Friends logo, they've got that particular style of lettering, and they just effectively flipped it so the fry of Friends gets flipped to the end. So it ends up reading ends Friday. And just by that one little switch, it conveys everything you need to know because the visual appearance of the type just makes it instantly recognizable as a Friends logo. And then you see ends Friday, and then all it had was a Channel 4 logo and 9 p.m. And I just love the conciseness of the idea. It just does everything it needs to do on a kind of functional level. It gives you all the information you need in one quick hit. But just as a piece of creative thinking, it's got this kind of timeless quality, I think, where that ad has long ago done its job, but you can almost put it up in a gallery and it would stand as almost just like a little 2-word poem that sums up something about that cultural moment. And I think it's some of the best advertising can work that way, where it's created for a very short-term commercial reason, but then it can take on this status of being a little artifact that somehow outlasts its original purpose.
Yeah, it's a great one. I mean, I think you've shown that to me before.
Oh right, yes, I've shared it on Twitter many times. Yeah.
And it's so good. I bet the person who came up with that felt very smug once they had that idea.
Yeah, totally. But you see it a lot in branding, even branding that isn't done by big, expensive branding firms. Just kind of, you walk down your high street and you see some of the names of the barber or the fish and chip shop, and they almost all contain some kind of play on words. Your barber's called a cut above or something. And there seems to be this human instinct to play with words, and I think it's a good instinct in the sense that people just recognize that's going to act as a little viral thing that within, if you open up the barber within a local town, giving it a name that's got some kind of pun or play on words makes it likely to get talked about and lends it a certain charm, a certain personality. And I quite like that aspect of branding. That I call it folk branding, where it's branding that's done not so much by professional branders, but just by business owners who just have this natural instinct for, they haven't got an ad budget or a marketing spend. All they've got is some name that's going to go up above their shop. And so many of them actually come up with quite creative names that work very well. I have to mention my favourite one, which is in Liverpool One shopping centre in Liverpool. It was a shopping centre that was opened maybe about 10 years ago. It was called Liverpool One. Everton, obviously the rival team, opened their own store within the Liverpool One shopping centre and called it Everton 2. So that that's now become its permanent address. And, I just love the simplicity of it, the cheekiness of it, even though I am actually a Liverpool fan myself. You have to kind of salute someone taking an open goal like that.
Well, Liverpool 1 could just change its name to Liverpool 3, surely, and then
Yeah,
go on and on.
yeah. There's a whole rebranding job to do there, I guess. But yeah, it does interest me the way wordplay works in the commercial world. You would think, given the commercial stakes, that brands would be very serious about words and some of them are, I guess. If you think of classic corporate language, it tends to be quite straight, quite safe, quite depersonalized in a way. But I think the best advertising and branding actually goes in the other direction. It realizes almost because the commercial stakes are high, you need to do something a little different, a little creative. Yeah, I think it's an interesting crossover between poetry and copywriting. They both actually draw on a similar set of skills, I think. Poetry is about using the fewest words possible, which is definitely a feature of copywriting as well, where you literally have to pay for more space if you want a bigger ad. So yeah, that kind of constraint-based writing, I think, is a common theme across both areas.
Yeah. So was it working in that industry that got you interested in using constraints in poetry?
I guess it was, yeah, because I'd almost without realizing it, I'd become, in my early years as a copywriter, I'd become very used to writing within constraints and tight spaces. You would often be given a brief that was 15 pages long and you had to get it down to 150 words or something. So I was naturally getting skilled in that, I guess. And then my first main foray into poetry was a project called Core Poetics, where I was working with this kind of business language all the time. When you read the briefs that I got sent, they would often contain this very dry, formal, impersonal, classic business type language. So I was wrestling with that language a lot and trying to turn it into a nicer end product. And at one point, it just occurred to me, what if you actually literally did that? So I took corporate mission statements and literally did a kind of version of cut-up poetry where you would take those exact words and try and rearrange them into something poetic. So I set myself that constraint. And I mean, the one rule was I didn't have to use all the words. I could just pick whichever ones worked, and I couldn't add in any extraneous words. But it was quite interesting. You would go onto the Goldman Sachs website, find their mission statement, and then just see what you could do with it, just only using that particular lexicon of words. That particular one turned into a limerick, which I might actually have to hand if you have one moment. But it's quite nice. The limerick just gives you a sense of what the original language was like. So it goes, "You wish to submit a concern regarding the firm. Who are you? Are you new? You will learn who is who. You will learn to submit to the firm." So I quite like the sinister kind of overtone of that, which I think is quite reflective of what I understand the Goldman Sachs culture to be. Yeah, so that was my first experiment in writing constrained poetry. And yeah, I think something clicked for me. I mean, I'm sure you would relate to this, but I found those constraints quite liberating. I think previously when I tried to write poetry, there's that thing of, you just got the blank page and I don't know, your feelings. And somehow you've got to turn it all into a poem. Whereas if you've actually got a set of words, and quite a limiting set of words that you have to start with, it literally gives you somewhere to start, and it cuts off so many.
Or just having a form like a sonnet. Yeah. Okay, I know it's only 14 lines. I can get through this.
Yes, totally. Yeah. So I remember that feeling of just thinking, yeah, I get why. I think I'd heard this idea before of constraints being liberating, and it totally makes sense. But yeah, I realized that actually seemed to play to my strengths more as a writer. And it got me a starting point. I mean, did you ever have a similar penny dropping moment like that where you thought, this is the way I'm going to write poems?
Yeah, so I started I played in punk rock bands, and I was the main songwriter, so I was writing lyrics. And then when I started writing poetry, it was free verse because that seemed like the obvious thing to do, having written song lyrics. And I couldn't do it because there was no structure there to guide me. Music, it acts as its own constraint in a way. It's its own structure to follow. So I just threw myself into learning everything I possibly could about formal poetry, and the more formal the poetry got, I feel the better it got. So the bigger the constraints, the freer I felt, and the more I enjoyed it too. I mean, that's a big part of it. I just
Did you have like a breakthrough poem where did you immediately get into kind of anagrams, palindromes, that kind of thing, or was it more writing, I don't know, traditional sonnets or that kind of thing?
It was traditional forms. So I went from writing free verse and really not enjoying it and not writing anything good. I don't think it took long once I learned about meter and form. I think I'm quite pleased with some of the early sonnets I wrote. Probably not enough to share them on Twitter now, I think, but I was fairly pleased quite early. There was a dramatic shift in my ability once I went from free verse to form.
Interesting, yeah. And was that self-taught?
Yeah. Lots of reading, lots of obsessive research in libraries, and whatever was on the internet at the time. Not as much as there is now. Now it's very easy.
Yeah, there's almost almost too much stuff now. I don't know how much poetry you read. Can you even read a piece of free verse these days, or do you just feel you're too committed to one world? It must be strange to go from doing what you do to reading a kind of very loose piece by someone else.
I do read some free verse, not too much, because of course, as well, running Penteract Press, I have to read. There are things I have to read. Lots of other people's work that's been sent to me or that I'm editing. So I don't often relax in the evening with poetry because it's what I've been doing during the day.
Busman's holiday, yeah. I don't know what order we'll do this whole conversation in, but I must ask you the main question I would like to know about your writing, I guess, because I'm a big enthusiast for what you do, and I've talked about it with various other people I know, and I find most people get it, and they feel the same way I do once I've enthused sufficiently about it. But I do find some people seem to struggle with the extremity of the constraint. I think some people. My question, I guess, to you is: do you come across this reaction, which is this kind of feeling of yes, but is it just a very clever technical achievement and essentially a kind of word game? But is it really poetry? And I'm just fascinated to know how you deal with that question, because to me, and I've got my own answer to it, but is that something you come across?
Oh yeah, it happens. Because I post everything on Twitter, of course. You know what a friendly place Twitter is. So of course I've experienced people saying things along these lines that it's soulless and it's just a technical feat. But the fact is, I enjoy that. I mean, I view what I do as I'm two poets in one, really. The one is trying to write something that is lyrical or humorous or otherwise traditionally poetic, despite the restriction. So that would be with a lot of poems where I'm only using one or two constraints. So just a palindrome, for example, I might try to make this a good poem despite the constraint. But then the other part, so that's a traditionalist poet in me who also likes writing sonnets and couplets. But then I'm also an avant-garde poet. So there I'm looking to mess around with language. I'm trying to break language. I'm trying to write something that doesn't sound like anything that's been written before. And then I will pile on the extreme constraints. So it doesn't sound like a human's written the poem. It sounds like some weird alien has composed it. So that's when I've got the really extreme constraints going. But it's intentional. I want language to sound weird. And I mean, I would also point out that I'm always working with a lot of constraints anyway, that I like to think there's music in everything I write. In the traditional ones, it's a very traditional sounding music. in the avant-garde ones, it's jazz. So there's always music on my mind.
Yeah.
And some people don't see that, and they just think, well, it's just a technical feat. But there is other stuff
Absolutely
definitely going on.
Yeah. And it's something I admire about your poetry is that within the technical accomplishment, there is a real kind of lyricism and I think particularly a sense of rhythm. You seem to have a very nice ear for the rhythm of the language, and that always comes across. And I think also somehow even within those David Blaine-like constraints, sometimes I almost feel there is a kind of Etherin voice that you almost start to recognize across the poems. There's a certain, as I say, a certain kind of slightly kind of lyrical, romantic quality to the language that I think is common to a lot of the poems. And yeah, and I find it weird that some people struggle to get that, because to me, what it seems to be is just a more intense version of what poetry is doing anyway, which is...
Oh, thank you. I mean, I like that as a comment. That's how I would hope people think about it.
Yeah. And that's why it puzzles me that some poets don't get it, because I kind of think, well, surely this is an intensified version of what poetry is. It's writing within constraints that appear to be arbitrary, and even if you just go back to kind of dum-de-dum rhyming verse, it's funny. I always have this memory of being in school reading. I think I was in sixth form. We were reading Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and I forget the particular line in question, but the teacher was getting us to discuss why Coleridge had chosen a particular word to end the line. And I always remember this kid in my class who was very, very smart, very science-minded. And I just remember this look of utter, almost like contempt on his face, where he was just... Because the obvious conclusion really was that Coleridge had chosen this word because it rhymed. It had to rhyme. It was at the end of the line. And it made the line slightly more obscure and harder to get, I think, in this particular case. And this kid was just, this is ridiculous. Why is this poet constrained by having to pick a stupid rhyming word when he could just tell us what he means? And I could just tell he just thought poetry was stupid. It's like, why wouldn't you just write down what you mean without these silly arbitrary constraints? And yet, of course, the thing is that the constraints are often a way to discover what you really mean. It's by following this kind of arbitrary structure that you unlock unexpected ways of using language, and you might discover the magic inside the constraint. So to me, that's what poetry does, and I think your poetry does it to really quite a radical extreme, which I think is really exciting and really in contrast in a lot of ways to what I see in the rest of the poetry world. I think a lot of poetry is not necessarily free verse, but it's less formal than maybe it used to be, which I don't have any automatic judgment about that. I think poetry can be whatever it wants to be, really, but I think using radical constraint is a way of re-energizing poetry in a way that I think is sorely needed. I think poetry does need almost like a set of jump leads attached to it in some way to get it going again, and I think extreme constraint can be one way of doing that.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I've noticed when people have made these objections to my more extreme stuff, and I don't know who said it to you, and you probably shouldn't tell me, otherwise I'll attack them.
Tell you later.
But they tend to be, so I don't know if this is true of the people you mentioned, but they tend to be people whose poetry itself is not musical. They're not interested in music, which is fine. Poetry doesn't have to be focused on music. On the contrary, I have a big fan base in the music community. So people they're not poets, they're musicians. They like my poetry. And I think that's got something to do with the abstract nature of music, perhaps. So when they're reading my poems, they're not looking for what's being said.
Yes.
They're looking at the way it's being said and the sounds that are being made and the rhythms.
Yeah. And that's partly what I think is in kind of welcome contrast to a lot of poetry these days, where I do think when you look at you look at write-ups of the big poetry prizes, for example, and you read about each collection, and this is partly a fault of journalism rather than a fault of the poets necessarily, but it tends to automatically go to who the poet is and what the poems are about. It's all about the subject matter. It's this is a collection about someone's experience of say losing a child, for example, or someone's experience of something particularly personal, intense, and that tends to be what the review is about. It's about the identity of the person writing and about the experiences they're writing about. But yeah, you can get to the end of a lot of poetry reviews and not have any idea what they're doing craft-wise. What kind of technical innovation is going on, and it's often just not mentioned in reviews or in book blurbs or just in the culture of poetry generally. I think it just tends to, as I say, fixate slightly more on the biographical details, I guess, of the poets involved and maybe the political outlooks, and all those things are perfectly valid parts of the mix, but they often seem to come to the exclusion of the actual craft and technical side. And I as I say, I see your poetry as a kind of radical counterbalance to all that, really, just a kind of challenge to the rest of the poetry world to say, well, poetry can also be this. What do you think of that?
Yeah. Well, do you think the poetry establishment, if we can call it that, the establishment, do you think it's too close-minded? I mean, that would suggest you do think that.
I guess so. I really enjoyed your episode with the Christian book. I think it was your 50th episode, where he was talking, I thought, in a very wise and humane way about you talked about lots of things in that episode, but he touched on the poetry world and the kind of, I guess, the kind of politics of that world as well. I felt broadly on his wavelength, really. Well, I feel there is, if you were trying to define the poetry establishment, I don't think it would. I think there's a certain narrow bandwidth of political views and outlooks that are considered acceptable, I guess. And also they're just generally given too much importance in the conversation. I think, and you could just say, well, maybe that's just been a wider part of culture generally in the last 10, 15 years. But I do think it's to the detriment of poetry in particular, because I think poetry really, if you approach poetry with a strong sense of who you are politically and what you want to say politically, I think it really does narrow you as an artist. It's the wrong kind of constraint in a way. It's like, it's weird that we actually live in a world of poetry where there's not much formal constraint, but there's quite a lot of political constraint in a way. And I think I sense, maybe I'm being too kind of broad brushstroke here, but I sense a lot of writers are quite uptight about possibly saying something wrong or exposing something about themselves that might be deemed problematic or somehow not in tune with the moment in some way. And I just feel that's a big pressure on writers at the moment. And it is hard to resist it if you're a writer trying to make your way in this kind of industry's too big a word for it, really, but in this this kind of small world of poetry, it's quite hard, I think, to resist that pressure to, as I say, not say the wrong thing or not. I just think that's not what poetry is at its best. I think poetry can be this alternative way of engaging with the world, an alternative to the political way of engaging with the world. I think it can be a more transcendent way of looking at the world. Obviously, poetry connects with the political, and you can choose to write political poetry, and you can choose to read poems in a political way. But I don't think that's all poetry is. I think it has to be bigger than that, and it has to, in some ways, reject the political and say, no, that there's another realm and another way of looking at life and reality that doesn't have to answer to political ideas that are already prescribed for every poet. Yeah, that was a semi-rant, but does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And it gives you an opportunity to mention your Substack because you have an article on there about this. From my perspective, it doesn't really bother me if people think all art is political because I don't think that, and it's not going to affect me. I'm just going to carry on doing what I'm doing. They're free to think that all art is political. I'm free to think that it isn't. The problem comes when suddenly my position is not acceptable. And I have to be re-educated. And there is that kind of feeling with among some people, not all people. I know people who think all art is political, who are quite happy for me to have my view. But I've also encountered people who will not accept that I don't think this. And that's the slightly sinister thing that's going on at the moment that I'm not entirely happy with.
Yeah, that is a useful distinction, actually, I think, because I agree with you that I totally can see the that way of looking at the world, that you can frame anything as political. You know, I mentioned in that article, this is a piece I wrote on my Substack about politics and art. But you can frame, you know, all knitting is political, all astronomy is political, all floristry is political, and all poetry is political. And it's not actually untrue to say that, because all of those things, even algebra, they all exist within a general framework of human interactions and power relationships and cultural factors. And, you know, I know how that whole kind of language game works in a way. It's one thing I slightly depressingly learned doing my English degree. Most of it was about critical theory and that way of playing that kind of clever language game of politicizing everything. And if anyone then comes along like you or I and says, no, but actually all poetry isn't political, you're just seen as being somehow naive, like you've not had the right education, you don't get it, you know, don't you realize that saying all poetry isn't political is itself a political thing to say? And, you know, it's and I get it's a kind of closed loop of a closed system of seeing the world that's hard to escape from. There's no real way out of it, and I think the only way out is to insist on there being other. I mean, I think of them as kind of spheres in society, in the world in general. You know, the political sphere, the artistic sphere, the religious sphere, and they all interact with each other and depend on each other, but they have to remain distinct in some way. And I think the kind of poetic and creative and artistic sphere is really the biggest one of all, and it's bigger than politics. And as soon as you say all art is political, you're really giving up the game. I think you're saying that that all art should ultimately be judged by the political agenda it's in service of, you know. And I think that is just a logical outcome of that way of looking at the world. And it does therefore trickle down into the way poetry books get reviewed. You know, it's, well, what political ideas are represented in this work? What's the identity of the person who's written it? What important job is it doing in terms of shedding light on a particular social issue? Or, you know, like you, I recognize all of those as valid questions, but they're just not the only questions to ask or the only way of looking at what poetry is. And I think if poets don't believe that, I find it just slightly bewildering almost. I just think, well, why are you writing? You know, why not just stick to writing prose or political pamphlets? You know, it's you have to somehow, surely you recognize on some level there's a different game being played here, and maybe a more important one.
Well, I don't think it's too hard to think of poems that are completely separate from politics, and not in the sense that they're opting out of politics. If you could think of, and I don't think this is unreasonable, you could think of any work of art as the culmination of a series of aesthetic choices. You can view it almost like an algorithmic, like a chart. You're picking between different things. Do I want to use this word or this word, and so on? So, like, for example, I'm currently drinking tequila and tonic.
Yes. Not
gin and tonic.
Interesting.
So that was an aesthetic choice. What was that based on? Was it based on the fact that I just prefer the taste of tequila, or is it somehow a political decision? I can't think of any way that that's a political decision.
Oh, I think you could play that game. You know, you
Someone
could
could, but yeah, but
talk about the
it would be
cultural
wrong,
history of
wouldn't it?
tequila and the associations it has in your mind, and
Yeah.
why do we even?
I like tequila just because I like the taste of it. I don't think we need to go deeper than that. I don't think we need to analyze why I prefer certain flavors.
What does the tonic really represent in terms of its relationship to the tequila? And yeah, I'm sure you could play that game of politicizing it, but I equally take your point that it's a bit of a stretch.
Yeah. Well, I don't like it when people go into well, it's an unconscious bias and they explain it because I don't think anyone is in a position to explain my unconscious. I think of all the people in the world, I am the best judge of my unconscious because I hear the things that it throws out into my conscious mind that I don't repeat to other people. Sometimes I dare not. So I think if anyone is an expert on my unconscious mind, then it's probably me, not this very critic.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I mean that's an interesting way of framing it. 'Cause you kind of think, well, maybe poets are actually the experts in unconscious experience. And but how do you feel with writing? Because I can imagine the political take on your work, if people insisted on putting it into that framework, it would not be so much about any individual poem, but it might be just about the overall project of I'm going to use one of the buzzwords of this kind of movement now, the way you privilege the idea of constraint or rigid structures. Maybe that in itself is a political construct of some sort. I'm trying to use the literary theory language here, but
well, this is, and of course, one thing that's said about ignoring palindromes and anagrams for now and just looking at formal poetry, sonnets, whatever, that has been described as colonialist poetry because it's the forms that were being used around the times when we were going around and kicking people out of their countries and stealing them. So, but then I wasn't involved in that.
I've heard rumors.
And as far as it being a political thing as well, I mean, I don't often talk about my political views, but I was sounds like the name of a punk song, I'm sure it is. I was a teenage anarchist. And I still my politics are still very far left, very anti-authoritarian, which is why I do have some issues with what's going on the left now because I'm on the anti-authoritarian side quite strictly. But still, I'm far left. I am certainly not interested in overly rigid systems of government. So, but I am interested in overly rigid systems of poetry.
Yeah, totally. That's a really fascinating inversion of the way I think most people are. Sorry, that's my dog rushing into the room. If you can hear background noise. But yeah, I think you don't believe in authority politically, but you believe in it structurally and artistically. And I think I suppose a lot of people are the other way around.
Yeah, someone could argue that. So I'm just reacting against my politics in my art. I mean, there's always something someone could say to make it political.
Yeah, and of course, the end result of your poems. There obviously is content. It's not just characters arranged on a page in a way that fulfills the palindrome or the anagram. There's a story being told. There's decisions you're making about I think quite often you use language from mythology and they are very powerful pieces. I think that. You can read in all sorts of ways. I often, again, this is slightly veering off into a different area, but I often think of your poems being a different reading experience almost to a lot of poetry, in the sense that some of them are so, they're almost like kind of language objects or sculptures, I think, where they're such crafted objects that I often feel like a book almost isn't the ideal medium for them. I think I've said this to you before on Twitter, but I often picture your work as a kind of artwork on a wall, where you can stare at it or just keep passing it on your way up the stairs or something, and you see it day after day, year after year, and you maybe notice a different aspect of the structure at different times. You because I think it's that intricately crafted that it lends itself. It's a visual object as much as a verbal object in a way. And I find it interesting the way poetry has ended up between the covers of books and placed on bookshelves. I'm a big fan of books, but some poetry, and particularly yours, I think, it feels like it could be out in the world in a different kind of way. And it's is that something you've pondered or explored in any way?
Well, it's an interesting idea. I mean, for one thing, we're both poets here. We know what book sales are like for poets. So if there's another way to get it out into the world, then I'm interested. I mean, it's something I've considered. I'm exploring lots of possibilities. I'll get your opinion on this. I've asked a lot of people lately. I'm still completely on the fence. What do you think about NFTs?
They've not really got me excited, I have to say. They partly because I just can't. The sense of ownership that is meant to come with them, I just can't. It doesn't land for me. I just feel, but it's just an image that can be so easily reproduced. I don't feel if I owned the NFT of one of your poems, I just don't feel it wouldn't kind of emotionally feel like ownership to me in a way that I would want to pay a lot of money for. And that
you want it in a frame on the wall. You want
I find it easier to imagine a new Anthony Etherin poem coming out, and it's a large print, beautifully printed and framed. There are only 50 copies that will ever be produced, and each one of them is 10 grand or something. And it's tapping into the art world way of monetizing the piece rather than the literary world way of monetizing stuff where you sell books at £10 a go and hope to sell enough of them. I can almost imagine if there was it almost had the status of a new Damien Hirst piece coming out rather than just a new Simon Armitage book. You know what I mean? Like if you could somehow tap into a different economic model. I think that's somehow, I guess it's an accident of history almost, but somehow painters and artists manage to tap into this different way of monetizing their work. They get incredibly rich patrons who invest in their work as a form of investment. And that never happened with poetry, but I don't see why it couldn't in a way, particularly with your type of work. I can just, you could make the same objection that I just made to NFTs. It's like, well, why would you pay 10 grand for a print when someone can just photograph that print and reproduce the text on a tweet somewhere? But to me, owning one of those limited edition prints, potentially, well, not just potentially, but it would just have more of a sense of value attached. It would feel a bit like owning a painting by a pretty well-known painter and knowing that, if you fall on hard times, you can always sell that Anthony Etherin poem.
If people still want it.
Yeah. But again, I think, I'm saying a lot of flattering things about your work, but I do think it's in the nature of your work that it will stand the test of time. If you think of it economically, it's a good investment because what won't change, if you base your poetry too much in politics, I think it can date and feel a bit of its period. But if you write, two palindromic sonnets that are perfect anagrams of each other, that's as much of a technical achievement in 500 years' time as it is now.
Yeah. Well, I do think about these things, but Bojo, no job, palindromes.
Yeah, totally.
In 100 years, are people going to care? I mean, and in fact, a few years ago, I had this, you might have seen it. I think everyone's seen it by now, the Idris Elba palindrome.
Yes.
about playing James Bond that took off, and I thought, wow, people love this. This is great. But then I thought, is anyone going to care about this?
But I think what
50, even
survives,
20 years from now.
maybe, yeah. But what doesn't fade is the technical achievement. I think if it is lovely when you see that Idris Elba one in the moment and it's topical, and it is nice to read something that well crafted that's also particularly topical to that moment. But in 50 years, someone could equally read it, and they might need to read a footnote saying Idris Elba was an actor who was up for the James Bond role or something.
Yeah. James Bond
given
was
that context. But yeah, you can still admire the technical accomplishment in a way you might struggle to with some other poetry.
Well, while we're talking about this, I mean, of course, we must talk about real-time notes where you are, but this is topical. This is literally what's going on every day. But I suppose that lasts as a document, so that's how it gets its longevity.
Maybe, yeah, that's what I would hope. Someone once compared it to Pepys's diaries in the sense that it can be nice to go back and read through a kind of day-by-day account of what were quite strange times. I started writing it in 2017, so we were in the middle of Brexit and Trump and various other stuff going on in the world. I didn't plan to do it. I just wrote a poem one day and took a screen grab and put it on Instagram, and found something appealing about the speed of it, the kind of roughness of it in a way. It felt like almost a kind of rebellious thing to do in a way, in a poetry world that can be quite kind of precious and uptight sometimes. I think it can be nice sometimes just to put something a bit more rough and ready out into the world. And I like the idea of poems being super topical. And so I kept doing it, and I set myself the constraint of I had to write at least one every day. But on some days I would end up writing 4 or 5, and other days I would squeeze one in at 11:59 p.m. But I managed to keep doing it, and I did it for 3.5 years, about 2,200 poems, I think it came to. And yeah, I mentioned before, like your use of extreme constraint, I consider almost like a set of jump leads on poetry. It's a way of just shocking it into a new state. And to me, that's what I was kind of trying to do with this, was to use time as the constraint, and speed poetry up in a way that it's not meant to be. It feels to me like the last taboo almost in poetry, or it feels like almost every other constraint has been challenged over time. Poetry no longer has to rhyme, it no longer has to scan. You can do found poetry where you didn't even write it yourself. You can do visual poetry. But I think there is this lingering assumption that poetry should take time. It's a kind of a slow art form. So I think there's something kind of counterintuitive about writing poetry fast. And so I found that interesting. And then I found, to me, it felt like we have these new opportunities as writers. We have these new platforms like Twitter and Instagram. And Insta poetry was becoming quite a big thing. But I felt like the poetry you were seeing on there wasn't really playing to the strengths of that medium. To me, the whole point of Insta poetry should be to embrace the instantness, and what that makes possible. The fact that you can immediately, Boris Johnson resigns, you can just immediately write a poem about it and immediately reach an audience. And that wasn't possible, even 20 years ago, 50 years ago. And so to me, there's just something interesting in exploring that new area. And so I wrote, lots of poems about Trump and Brexit, but they were all mixed in with kind of personal stuff as well. Lots of quite mundane stuff. I would write a poem about going to put the bins out or something. So you're trying to convey some of the stuff of real life. Write poems, instant obituaries for celebrities dying, and poems about natural disasters and school shootings, and so it's quite a range of comedic stuff and actually quite heavy, serious stuff as well. And I kind of saw it in two simultaneous modes in a way. Part of me thought, well, I didn't want to make any great big claims for it, because in a way it was just a kind of, some of them were essentially kind of jokey social media type poems. But I also, in some ways, had quite deep literary ambitions for the whole thing, where I did see it as a kind of, not so much 2,000 little poems, but one big poem that took 3.5 years to write, that had kind of plot lines and had this kind of sense of engagement with the real world that I felt was quite unusual for poetry. I must actually send you some copies. I'm aware I'm talking about a book you probably haven't seen very much of.
I don't. I should have a copy. In fact, I mean, I've obviously seen what you put on Twitter, and of course, I have to mention that some of these poems are in the book of Penteract.
Oh yes, yeah, that was quite an honor.
And they're anagram based. So you was that done because you were struggling to think of something, thought I need a constraint to help me, or was it more just you just wanted anagrams in there?
Yeah, I did find that my very first conception of the project was I was literally going to try and write it as a kind of stream of consciousness, almost like a live writing thing. And I quickly realized that was going to be pretty hard to make any good. So I would basically try and write poems as fast as I could. I think probably the average for each one might be about half an hour or an hour. And I found, that it wasn't enough just to rely on the time constraint. I needed other things to give me ideas. So if you said, well, okay, I'll try and write a limerick or an anagram poem or a sonnet, or and some of them were visual poems as well. They were more like kind of visual gags in a way. So I tried to have quite a wide range of starting points, because I did find that was the best way to. Because there were definitely days where you felt, that sense of writer's block. What the hell am I going to write about? And that's where the extra constraints could be useful. So I remember writing that Hurricanes one, which appears in your book, which was written during hurricane season, and obviously that one took longer to write than most of the real-time notes poems. I remember sitting there for a whole evening trying to craft these anagrams into something resonant and topical. But I'm talking to Anthony Etherin here, so you know what it's like to write an anagram poem. But I found that I think I actually had a very different way of doing it to what I imagine you do, where I would actually look online for, what are good anagram words. I think I even saw the last line in that poem is salvage souls, God saves us all. And God saves us all is an anagram of salvage souls. But that was a found anagram. I found that on some list somewhere of nice anagrams. So actually what I was doing in that poem was, not in all cases, but in some of the cases, I was finding anagrams from various places online, and then I was stitching them together in a way that would create a kind of flowing narrative poem. I suspect that's very different to what you do. I don't know if you use kind of online tools in that way, or if you would consider that cheating in some way.
I don't consider it cheating. I don't use them except for when I'm in a tight spot. Sometimes I might have to, but I've actually found that the results are better for me anyway. They're better when I don't use them, because you can end up. It's about selection, I think. If you are given some options, it's easy to just say, "Yeah, that'll do." Whereas if you have to work it out yourself, you will keep trying. You'll keep going until you find the best result. But I will anyway. Everyone works differently.
Yeah.
But, I'm kind of a technophobe, so I try to keep away from software as much as possible.
Interesting, yeah. I'm sure you've been asked this given recent news and stuff, but how do you feel about AI coming in and potentially, I mean, right now, ChatGPT doesn't seem to be great at writing poetry or constraint-based writing. You know, I've asked it to write palindromes and anagrams, and it really just can't do it. It's quite
No,
strange, you know.
it's people have asked me, you know, what are you going to do? Is it going to take your job? I've experimented with it, and to be honest, it's the free verse poets who need to be they're the ones who need to be worried. It's better, much better at that than it is at more technical stuff.
Maybe, yeah. But it's interesting what you were saying earlier about you almost aim for the effect of feeling like your poems have been written by a kind of non-human voice. And to me, it doesn't seem inconceivable that, you know, by the time we're on ChatGPT 10 or 15, it could be much more adept at playing with palindromes and rhyme and anagrams and so
definitely.
on. Yeah, and it will be a challenge, I guess, to constraint-based poets. That actually
Well, I don't think it'll be any more of a challenge for constrained poets as it is for any poet. I think we all need to be looking over our shoulders, no matter what you do. Like say free verse, whatever. Of course, visual artists. I mean, that's where it's making, in some ways, the biggest strides. And I know some illustrators, visual artists who are quite concerned about becoming obsolete within the next few years.
Yeah, I think there's an optimistic and pessimistic way of looking at it. I think the optimistic one would be that it actually makes human creativity even more precious and important and potentially more valued in future, because it's the one thing machines can't do, you know, particularly with visual art. They can draw on a vast bank of all the stuff that already exists, and they can riff on that infinitely. But what they can't do is make, or, you know, what they maybe can't do is make the kind of leap that a human creator might make in terms of doing something that hasn't been done before, you know. And obviously all humans are, in a sense, a bit like the AI. We're all riffing on the past in some way, you know. But I do think there's having a hand, you know, my wife is a painter. She paints landscapes and abstracts, and that's something that AI, I guess, will never be able to recreate, is that sense that you're looking at a painting on a canvas and you know that is the hand of the creator. You know, you can see the brush strokes. And I think that's part of what makes art valuable, is you look at Mona Lisa or something, and you can literally see the brushstroke of the guy who was doing it a few years ago. There's something very uncanny about that, magical, I think.
Yeah, and as you very kindly said earlier, when you're reading my poems, you said you saw a common theme throughout them, a common feel, a voice. So I think maybe that's true as well. That's something that AI won't be able to replicate.
Is it conceivable to you to find a poem beautiful and moving and transcendent, even if you know it was written by an AI?
Ask me in 2 years or 3. Yeah. It hasn't. That's a very difficult question. I have no idea. I'd like to think that the answer is yes, that I would still. No, actually, maybe I'd like to think the answer is no. I honestly don't know, because part of me would like to think that I'm just judging it on its quality, and I don't care about who's written it. But then, of course, I also value humanity.
Yes. Yeah, and I do think that will endure. You know, I think you could compare it to chess, and there were lots of dark predictions that the game of chess would basically be over by the time computers got better at it than we are, which they long ago did. You know, computers have got better. But the game itself is as popular as it's ever been, maybe more popular. And people still enjoy seeing the head-to-head battles between two real human beings who are doing.
Yeah. And chess players are learning from the machines and getting better by seeing what moves machines make. So that it's changed the game of chess It's changed the human game of chess.
Yeah. And I do think that's what could happen with art generally and with writing. And, I think maybe I'm inclined to be more of an optimist about all of this stuff, where I think particularly with writing, there's something almost quite, some people might scoff at this, but almost inspiring seeing what's happening at the moment with these large language models, where I think you can almost conceive of what's happening as the computers are essentially reverse engineering the human mind by looking at all of its written output over decades and centuries. And from that, it's kind of building a model of a kind of collective human mind in a way that, and I know there are all kinds of objections to that in terms of infringing the copyright of all the creators who have created that work over the years. But I think there's also a nice way of looking at it where you think, because I think as writers, generally, we all worry about the futility of it all. Maybe we're just mere blips that will all be forgotten, and only a handful of poets will ever get remembered. But actually, it could turn out that all of it counted. All of it has fed into the creation of what could be a kind of collective human intelligence that draws on everything we've written. Every bad poem, every discarded novel draft, as long as somehow it's come across the radar of the AI now or at some point in the future, it all feeds into this system that, as I say, maybe it's a naive way of looking at it, but I think there's something kind of redemptive about that almost. It's this idea that.
Well, no, I agree. Yeah, this is the kind of thing I tell myself, and I think, will people remember my work 100 years from now? Well, hopefully I've already done enough, even if they don't, but I've influenced someone who's then done something that's remembered. Because it all branches out, doesn't it? So that's like a consolation prize. If my work isn't remembered, then I've probably done enough that I'll have had some small influence on something that is remembered.
Yes,
that's not very optimistic, but it's the best I can do.
Yeah, no, I'll take it. I think if we're all, and you're right that in some ways that story I've just told doesn't necessarily need the involvement of AI. You could say it was all happening already, where we were already all influencing each other and playing into this kind of collective mind and culture that evolves over the years. But I think AI just raises it to an interesting new level that I think it's going to be a very interesting time to be a writer. I think I actually feel lucky as a writer to have lived through the times we have, the advent of the internet and social media, and now AI, which I think is just as big a kind of step change as switching on the internet. And I think they're all kind of challenging things and slightly disconcerting things, and no doubt have negative effects. But I think they all create this kind of new playground for writers because one of the difficulties with being any kind of writer is just you're coming into the story long after many other great poets and novelists and writers have already been and gone and done a lot of the best work. So you're desperately searching around for, well, what else is there to write? What else is there to say? And actually, with all these new technologies, I think it opens up a vast new ground to go out there and play on and do interesting things with.
Oh, definitely.
That's my optimistic vision, anyway.
We've talked about real-time notes. I wanted to ask you another question about that. Do you see yourself as a conceptualist, as a poet? Do you think that the concept, and maybe this comes from your work as a copywriter, is the concept as important as the content?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've never particularly used the word conceptualist about myself, but it's definitely a word that chimes with advertising and design, where it's very, they literally use that word concept. What's the concept? What's the idea? And yeah, so I do think I naturally think in those terms, like what's the idea behind the writing? And it's usually, not to go back to that conversation, it's not a political idea or a point of view, but it's some kind of structural idea or formal idea. And I guess I broadly describe myself as an experimental poet in the sense that I see myself as being. I almost don't think of myself as being fully in the poetry world. I kind of it's one of the things I do amongst other things, writing prose and humorous stuff and essays and advertising writing and so on. So it's one thing I do. But when I do it, yeah, I guess I feel what I can bring to it is, yeah, a kind of conceptual sensibility and maybe some kind of interesting, yeah, idea or framing device that sets up the poetry in a way that will get people's attention, I guess. Yeah. A while ago, for example, I think this Christian book has done something similar actually, and no doubt done it better, but I created a kind of Rubik's Cube it was kind of ad slogan generator. So it had all these kind of slightly cliched business words on it, and it would generate these 3-word taglines. So I'm interested in that kind of idea, that kind of generative experimental idea. As I say, I've done projects like text radio where it's an experiment in what happens is there some kind of medium that has the spontaneity of speech but also has the slightly more considered quality of writing. And that was the idea of the concept, I guess, of that project, was to explore that kind of intermediate state between talking and writing. So yeah, I guess I do naturally have a mindset that thinks about ideas like that.
Yeah, well, that's the impression I get, because of course the Perpetual Disappointments Diary, which I'm sorry that I didn't know about that until this week. I will definitely buy a copy because I've seen enough. I've seen some bits online. This is fantastic.
Thank you.
That's conceptual. Yeah. That's very conceptual, but clearly well executed too. And most importantly, a success.
Yes, I know, that's such a rare thing. But yeah, that started out as, literally noticing that there was such a thing as an appointments diary, and therefore what would a disappointments diary look like? And it kind of tied in with another thing I was doing at the time, which was playing with kind of English proverbs and giving them a twist and writing a kind of downbeat version of them. So the end result was this Perpetual Disappointments Diary, which is a journal, a functional diary that you can buy and use, but it's full of demotivational quotes. So, for example, if a tree falls in the woods and no one is there to hear it, does that remind you of your life? That was one of them. When the going gets tough was another one. But yeah, each one was a kind of it was meant to be a kind of reaction to the culture of positivity that you see a lot on Facebook and social media generally. It was a kind of stoical resistance to that, really, actually being a bit more down to earth and realist.
Yeah.
And it was full of other, having got the overall concept, it was full of kind of mini concepts, I guess. So it had a spread of useful travel phrases near the beginning that were all translated into different languages, but it was all things like I am on the wrong plane, I have destroyed my hire car, what meat is this, do you have any very cheap wine, I am sorry I spilt your drink. So it was all the kind of phrases that a slightly challenged loser might have to use while they're on their travels, and mostly written from personal experience.
Well, it's so good because you've had this great idea and then followed it up with all these smaller ideas, which are all brilliant in their own way. Was it difficult to think of these additional things you could add?
It took a while, yeah. The main thing was thinking of the 52 demotivational proverbs, one for each week. But then, yeah, it was full of. I kind of just bought a diary from W.H. Smith's and looked at all the stuff you get at the front and the back of a diary, the kind of conversion charts for meters to kilometers. I've got one here, but with each of those things, I would try and do a kind of downbeat twist on it. So, as well as the kind of standard conversion stuff, it would also have 1 miss equals 1 mile. one stare equals 1,000 yards, one damp squib equals 0.13 lead balloon. So it kind of had these little hidden jokes that you only really saw when you read the kind of small print on the tables. And then it would have blank note spreads at the back for things like notes towards an abandoned screenplay, notes toward a laboured poem. It had a contact section for people who never call. It had a next year planner called The Gaping Void Ahead. So it was the whole, thematically, every spread would contain at least one joke on that kind of downbeat theme. And as I say, it's the one thing I've done where it kind of hit a commercial scene completely unexpectedly. But I guess people do actually buy diaries, and they buy them.
Well, how did that?
People.
How did this come about? Because you self-published it.
Yes.
And then
so initially it was alongside a design company who I was already working with on other stuff. I kind of partnered up with them. We printed 1,000 copies. And I was doing it, I paid for it to be printed, found a relatively cheap printer. So I think I paid about $1,000 to print 1,000 copies of it, thinking that this would be my kind of self-promotional piece as a writer, and that would be its main value. But then they all sold within about 2 weeks, and we printed more of them. And then it turned into a kind of a little cottage industry for a couple of years. Me and my wife Sue, we would print these things and sell them online, and I would send out kind of hopeful press releases to various places and nearly always get ignored. But then bizarrely, just before Christmas, New York Times got in touch and said, "Oh, we got your press release, can we interview you?" And before I knew it, I was a fairly decent sized profile in one section of the New York Times. And so suddenly your sales spike crazily for about 24 hours, and then it actually falls off a cliff again a couple of days later. But that was quite a nice adventure in independent publishing, and we made a bit of money from it. But we found it was also, I'm sure you find this as well, it was a lot of hard work actually handling the production side of things. We would quite often have issues with printers where we had various production issues. The covers were curling, and there were delays in shipments and all sorts of things. And then you had the kind of mailing them all out kind of side of things, which is I became a well-known face at my local post office. So it did get to a point eventually where we didn't have the energy to keep doing it every year. And I actually let it go fallow for a couple of years. And thankfully, at some point, it occurred to me to approach a proper publisher. And I kind of knew, or I did some research online and eventually found a kind of publishing agent and it was a very easy sell for them because we could already prove that it had sold quite a lot independently.
I was going to say, if you just say to them, we printed 1,000 that sold in 2 weeks.
Yeah,
I think any publisher's going to pick that up.
Yeah, so we ended up with Pan Macmillan, and they did it properly for about 3 years. It's kind of gone quiet now. We haven't done a new issue for a couple of years. I am planning to try and revive it at some point, but there are pros and cons, I think, to the big publishing world. On the one hand, it was exciting just to hand over all of that job and then see your book magically appear in a shop. You'd walk into Waterstones and see it on a shelf, and that's a nice feeling. On the other hand, I have to say it was a fairly impersonal process. I was kind of thinking, I've got the whole machine of Pan Macmillan behind us now. They're going to be doing all sorts of press releases on our behalf or something. And publishers generally don't do very much. They take a punt on various titles, but they really leave it to the authors to do the promotional side of things. So it's still very much down to you to try and keep the momentum going. But it's been nice to see it kind of go around the world and end up we even get kind of random letters from people sometimes just saying how much they like it, or I think some people bizarrely find it quite therapeutic and comforting in a way, having something. We've had letters from somebody who said, I've just come back from my father's funeral and had a pretty shitty few years, and they found it consoling and real and stoical, and quite a touching letter to receive. Really, just I think lots of I guess art works counterintuitive in that way. You would think, oh, this is a downbeat, cynical kind of form of humor, but actually it can land quite differently, I think, for some people.
Well, humor sells, doesn't it? I mean, that's the one side. Do you ever feel like we're wasting our time with poetry, considering how poorly poetry sells compared to pretty much any other kind of book?
Yeah, interesting. I mean, it's not a way to make money. There are, you get the very odd exception who get, Ruby Kaur or someone who they always get talked about because they're the only one who somehow managed to do it. They somehow managed to get a lot of money out of poetry. So I think in the sense of making money, it's a pretty poor field to go into, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's wasting time. There's that quote about there's no money in poetry, but there's no poetry in money either. And I guess the value of doing poetry is non-financial. It's about leaving that mark on the world and giving someone something to read in 500 years' time or whatever.
And having fun.
Yes.
That's I'm trying to stress that at the moment with other poets when I need to give them a pep talk.
Right.
You're in this for the fun, not the money.
It is a bizarre economy, the whole thing. It seems to me the poetry world is mainly sustained by poets buying each other's work. It's quite a small world that doesn't reach a kind of general readership that often. I one of the things I liked about Real Time, though, is not that it became a huge thing, but it got coverage in The Guardian and a couple of other places, Irish Times, and I like the fact that they're also using social media. I'm sure you found this as well. You reach a readership that is slightly beyond the poetry world. It's not people who subscribe to poetry journals. It's people who are just scrolling through Instagram and see your poem somewhere in between photos of people's lunches or something. So that I always found that nice. I think poets do have to look for creative ways to find new audiences, and maybe that's where the conceptual side of things comes in. I think that's, I guess, when I'm being conceptual, it's not for its own sake. It's actually to try and think of a new way of doing poetry, or a new kind of idea that will somehow break through and cast poetry in a slightly less familiar framework.
So we still have a couple of things left. We've been talking a long time, but I'm really enjoying this conversation.
Me too.
We must talk about songwriting, because I know you've got lots of opinions on songwriting.
Yeah, well, I guess I had a question for you, really, because I know you're active in that whole area, or as you were saying, you started in that area. As I say, I've had this, I've had a kind of lifelong interest in songwriting, although I'm not a highly accomplished musician by any means. But I recently got into the kind of Tim Panelli era songwriting and lyric writing, and I've become quite fascinated with the history of that time. It's kind of a forgotten era in music, but there were some really brilliant constraint-based writers really working in that period who would you would be working within a very tight structure, the kind of 32 bar verse bridge verse structure, and they would just do infinite variations within that structure. You would be mapping the right vowel sound or consonant sound onto particular parts of the melody. The words very much were in service of the singer and of the melody in general. So it was quite a disciplined form of writing, I think, where you couldn't just be Mr. Poetic. You had to kind of have the humility to see the word as being part of a bigger thing. So I like the challenge of writing that way. I think something really magical happens when language and music overlap. I just think they're two such kind of wonderful systems in their own right. Music is an amazing mystical thing, and language is, its own kind of miracle in a way. But when you put the two together, quite special things happen. The most mundane line or lyric can just sound incredibly poetic in the right setting sometimes. So
Yeah, well, I think so. I mean, and again, this is what I found really, that it's the gestalt, isn't it? The music and the lyrics together. There are so many bands I like, and I'll listen to a song and I think the lyrics are amazing. The lyrics are really great, and then I'll find them written down without the music and read it, and it just looks like terrible poetry.
yeah,
But somehow, when it's with the music, it sounds good, and they are good lyrics.
yes.
They're just not good poetry. So there's a distinction. Lyrics
Oh,
are just
absolutely.
poetry good to music.
Yeah.
A different thing.
Yeah. I mean, you get that perennial question of, is Bob Dylan as good as Keats? And when you take Bob Dylan's words away from the music, they really don't look like very good poems. But to me, it's just a very strange question to ask in a way, because I always feel there's an assumption built into it that poetry is somehow a higher art form than song, whereas to me, song is almost the state to which poetry aspires in a way. I would almost flip the question around and say, well, Keats is good, but is he a Bob Dylan? Because to me, yeah, song is just a more primal thing, a more complex art form and it's more connected to life in a way. You can go and listen to songs in a stadium, or you can listen to them on your own with your earbuds on. And it's kind of enmeshed in everyday life in a way that poetry just can't be really. And it's just one of the inbuilt advantages of song. And it can be a great communal thing as well, song. And so I think it's, I mean, I try not to think of art as kind of high and low art really, but I think if anything, I would say song is one of the higher art forms. And as a culture, we've somehow got it the wrong way around, that we use the word poetic as a compliment. We say, oh, that's like poetry in motion, or what a poetic turn of phrase that is. Or if we're
But we should use it negatively, like at your perpetual disappointments. It should be like, well, how's this selling? It's selling poetically. It means
yes,
it's selling.
yeah, totally, yeah. But yeah, I find it bizarre that we kind of have these conversations. Bob Dylan's good, but is he a poet? It's like, well, why are you using the word poet as a kind of value judgment? It's just a category. It's just a descriptor of a certain form of artistic activity. It shouldn't be used as a kind of as a kind of value judgment. I just find that strange. But what do you think about song versus poetry? I mean, not that you necessarily have to rank them, but do you find, is your heart more in poetry than it is in song, or the other way around?
Well, music's the first love, so there's no getting away from that. I think I'm a failed rock star, so that's always there with me.
And when you wrote lyrics, or maybe you still do, but would they be very constraint based as well, or purely constrained by having to work with the song? Or
just the music,
palindromic lyrics, for example?
No, the only time I've done that, I've done it the other way around. I've put one of my palindromes to music.
But you've written palindromic music though, haven't you? Like palindromic melodies and so on.
Yeah. Thank you for mentioning that.
I find that fascinating.
People need to know more about that. In fact, I should mention it more. I should put more of this on Twitter.
Yeah. Well, I think I think that there's a fertile area, I think, in that kind of crossover between music and writing. Like, because music is another art form that it had its heyday, I guess, in the 60s, 70s through to the 90s, where you could write one good song and you could retire off it. You could, and that's not really the case anymore. Spotify means that lots of even very successful musicians are struggling to make a living purely by writing songs and recording them and selling them. You have to go on tour, and you have
I was going to say, it all comes from performances now, doesn't it?
Yeah. Which I think is a shame, because to me the most interesting thing about music is just hearing new stuff being created by. I don't really want to see bands touring the same album for 3 years. I'd rather they were back in the studio in a few months, writing new songs, because that to me is the really magical thing, is hearing a new song by someone you think is really good. So I think they're struggling kind of financially to how do you get people to buy a physical object as opposed to just listening on Spotify. I sometimes wonder if there's an area for buying, a book with an accompanying download or vinyl or whatever it is, but somehow combining it. So, I can imagine buying an Etherin release that's poetry and music, and maybe there is writing about the music as well, or there's a bundle of podcasts that go with it or something, but it's somehow an audio and literary release in one thing.
Yeah, isn't it interesting? Would you say that you think like a businessman?
Yeah, I if you could see my bank account, you would know I'm not really a businessman. And my motivation in most things in life is very rarely business focused. I tend to do quite kind of quixotic projects like real-time notes, where the amount of work I put into them is just crazy when you look at the money it generates afterwards, which is maybe just about enough to cover the production costs and a bit more or something. So I don't think I'm a businessman in the sense of being a very successful one, but I guess I'm interested in, I see it almost as a creative challenge. I think, why is it so hard to get poetry out there into the world, or to get music out there into the world? And I see it almost as, again, using that word conceptual, as a conceptual challenge. What are maybe we're missing something, maybe we're thinking about the question in the wrong way, and maybe it's kind of a creative challenge in itself to think, well, if people aren't buying poetry, maybe that's our fault in a way, and maybe poetry needs to be something different. And as I say, maybe it needs to be in a frame on a wall instead of in a book, or so that style of thinking, I guess, appeals to me. But I wouldn't necessarily say it's a business way of thinking. It's just more it just fascinates me that are there any missed opportunities out there that would just get more good art and good poetry to a bigger audience.
I'm extremely impressed that you are clearly an ideas man. Whether or not they make money, who cares? Ideas are good on their own, and sometimes they do make money. I mean, I'm going to be fuming after this interview, thinking you sold 1,000 copies of a book in 2 weeks.
Yeah, believe me, that was the exception. I need to think of more ideas like that. That's I'm still dining off that one 10 years later.
Do we have time for one more question, or do you think?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah,
because you mentioned to me that you're interested in self-directed learning.
Yeah.
First of all, what do we mean by this?
Yeah, I wrote a post about this actually. It was called "The Opposite of School." This is all on my Substack, which is nickasbury.substack.com. But anyway, it was kind of an unusually personal post in a way, because it was about our experience with. I have a son, 12-year-old son, who had a increasingly difficult time in school, to the point where, having considered all kinds of other options and stuff, we eventually realized, well, actually, we don't have to send them to school. We can actually, we discovered this other thing called self-directed learning, or it also has this other name, unschooling. And it's something, there's a growing interest in this area where school, worked pretty well for me. I think it works pretty well on average for, a lot of kids, but it really doesn't work for some kids. And it's just a system that marginalizes some kids, turns them into, they develop a self-image of being a failure, or just being, not fitting in somehow. And, some kids do end up having a miserable time. You spend the rest of your adulthood kind of trying to recover from it, really. So yeah, we stumbled into this area of unschooling, and he's now not at school. He's doing his own thing, which it's a weird feeling as a parent to kind of slightly step back, and you're still there as facilitators trying to respond to the things he's interested in and give him opportunities to pursue them, and but you're also not making him follow any set curriculum, or and it makes you question all of your assumptions about education and how it works. And it made me look at myself, and I wanted to ask you about this, but it made me look at myself and think, well, actually, most of the skills I use now, the main one being writing, I feel they're not really the product of schooling or higher education, really. I think I was already into writing at really quite a young age, and I think I would have been anyway. You wonder how much of where we end up in life happens kind of despite education rather than because of it. And yeah, so I'm really interested to know with you whether, what your kind of education in writing was, or in literature. Did you have a kind of traditional background in that sense, or did you just discover poetry later and dive into YouTube and other places and teach yourself?
Well, I like the idea that you think I'm young enough that YouTube was around when I was learning.
Yeah, take the compliment.
My education was I was a scientist, right. So I A levels, maths, physics, chemistry, degree in physics. So I left my education in English behind at the age of 16.
Okay.
So yeah, all the poetry stuff is self-taught. But I was thinking about this earlier, preparing for the podcast. And I think, well, I was self-taught in everything anyway, because people learn in different ways.
Mm.
At school, I used to just mess around in class. I didn't want to be taught. I think this is my hatred of authority.
Yeah.
I didn't want teachers. I didn't want mentors. I didn't want anyone telling me what to do. My attitude was, I'll just get hold of the syllabus and I'll go and teach myself.
Mm.
And I was a straight A student.
Right.
So
yeah.
Just messing around all the time. But in my private time, that's when I learn everything.
Yeah.
Because that was how I like to learn. I don't like being in groups and being taught by people. I want to learn by myself.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's I think that's definitely a personality trait that a lot of smart people have. Is that, I think the kind of clinical term for it would be demand avoidance, where it's not just a kind of stubbornness or contrariness. It's just literally what's even something you want to do. If someone comes in and tells you to do it, it just immediately puts you off.
Yeah.
And I think school is designed with exactly the opposite mindset in mind. It's everyone sit down, face the front of the class, and we're now going to talk about history for 45 minutes. And then actually, if you're getting really into it and you're actually really into that lesson, tough, because we're going to stop now and we're now going to talk about maths and we're all going to do it together. And it's all very regimented, and then it's all leading down this one path towards each milestone, the SATs or the GCSEs or the A levels. And so you're constantly being funneled through this system. And I think it does bend a lot of people out of shape. And I guess one good side is that, it sounds like in your case, maybe it gave you something to push against in a way. It was almost like a constraint that you could resist. But I do find it funny that you have this resistance to authority, and yet you set these incredibly restrictive boundaries for yourself when you're writing.
Yeah, well, I guess I am my own authority. It's that idea. So I get to choose the restrictions. If someone else told me, if someone said to me, "You've got to write a palindrome," then I would kick back.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I think I've just found the way to end your career. No, it's really interesting though. I think I wonder if you could take a survey of poets who are currently active and published, and how many of them are self-taught or come from slightly alternative backgrounds, like science backgrounds, for example. Because you get the feeling it's poetry is quite institutionalized these days. It tends to be people go to certain courses in certain universities, or go to certain writing groups, and go through a certain system that maybe just kind of shapes people in a certain way. So when you do get an outsider like yourself coming in, it's the positive of that for you is that you're you've got an advantage in the sense that you haven't been shaped in the same way as everyone else. But I guess the downside is you haven't got that kind of place in the hierarchy, or you're not one of the in crowd.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But then that's the importance then of making your own space, finding your own scene. Which is
totally. Yeah. No, and I admire the way you've done that with the press and actually with this podcast as well. I think it's a really good idea to kind of, because no one else is going to do it for us in a way. You have to build your own communities of
exactly.
like minds who because probably within your local town or community there's not going to be another poet who's deeply into anagrams or palindromes, but there might be someone on the other side of the world who thinks exactly the same way. And it is one of the great things about social media, that it does allow people with niche interests to connect in ways they couldn't before.
Yeah, I mean, I would have been in a lot of trouble 20 years ago with my background, just trying to get anywhere. Yeah, but as soon as I started the Twitter account, things just started taking off after years of getting nowhere with poetry. I got onto Twitter, and a year later, I suddenly had a following, and I was friends with poets from all around the world.
No, I think for all that people, understandably moan about Twitter, I think it's been, at its best, it has been an amazing thing for creative people. I certainly had a kind of enjoyable era, I guess, in the kind of 2010 to 2015 kind of time. It felt like a very creative, interesting place to be, made lots of connections that led to new projects and new creative things happening. And just, I think obviously it's become a slightly darker place since then, and a frustrating place in many ways. But that aspect of it is still there in theory. I think it's nice the way it allows me, just for example, to see what you're up to. I can just see a new poem or a new thought, and it is still, for all its faults, it's still a nice way of just keeping that low level contact going with people. So I hope it survives in some form, or someone else comes along and does a better version of it. I think Substack is a kind of an interesting place at the moment. It could develop into that alternative platform. It's where I do most of my writing these days.
I'm just getting used to it, because I had to. I was on, my newsletter was on MailChimp, and then they've decided that now I have to pay, so I left and went to Substack. So I'm getting used to Substack, but I can really see there are a lot of options there, and I imagine there are just going to be more and more. They're going to keep adding different things you can do. Obviously, I can do a podcast on there. I don't know. I can somehow just plant this podcast onto that. I've got to figure this out, but
I think you probably can fairly easily, and it's. I think the best thing about Substack, which it must never change, is that it gives you ownership of your own audience. I mean, I sound like a businessman again saying that, but I think it is quite an important thing that you can leave Substack anytime. And, if you've built up a following of, 1,000 people or something, you can bring them with you. You're not trapped inside Substack in the way that you are in places like Twitter, where if you leave Twitter, that's it. You can't somehow take your followers somewhere else. So it does give you some direct relationship with your readers, which I think is going to be pretty important for writers in, what are going to be pretty interesting years ahead, I think. But I think to whatever extent you can maintain a direct relationship with a group of readers, that's going to be pretty important to cultivate, I think.
Agreed. I think we have to call this a night, because as much as I'd love to carry on talking, I have to edit, and I hate editing, so I can't let the podcast go on too long.
Yeah, well, it was really enjoyable. I could talk about so much more, but just to finish, I do, as I say, I've followed your work for a long time and followed this podcast as well. So it's nice to actually appear on it, and to be continued.